Someone in your tribe just died. Not a stranger, not someone you had heard of, someone you hunted with, someone whose voice you knew from the dark. Someone whose absence right now is a specific shape, not a general loss but a particular one with a particular weight that sits in the place where they used to be. This is 100,000 years ago. There are no funeral homes, no clergy, no death certificates, no established protocol for what happens next. There is only the body and the group, and the specific, disorienting experience of a social world that has a hole in it where a person used to be. What happened next, what those ancient humans did in the hours, days, and weeks after someone died, is one of the most revealing windows we have into prehistoric human social life. Drop in the comments, have you ever lost someone in a group you were part of? Just yes or no. I want to know before we go further. The conventional account of prehistoric death focuses on the physical. What did they do with the body? Where did they put it? What objects did they place alongside it? The archaeological questions. These are real questions with real answers, but they miss the most important thing about what death meant in a prehistoric band. In a group of 30 to 50 people, the typical hunter-gatherer band size, every member is known. Every member has a history with every other member. The relationships are not abstract. They are specific, embodied, accumulated over years of shared experience. When someone dies in a group this size, it is not a statistical event. It is a social catastrophe. The loss of one person removes approximately 2 to 3% of the group's total population simultaneously. It removes a specific set of skills, a specific set of relationships, a specific set of knowledge that existed nowhere else. And it does something to the survivors that the archaeological record cannot directly capture, but that neuroscience is only now beginning to fully understand. Grief in its acute phase is not primarily an emotional experience. It is a cognitive one. Neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor at the University of Arizona describes acute grief as a form of prediction error. The brain builds detailed predictive models of the people it is closest to, models that include where they will be, what they will say, how they will respond. These models are used constantly in social navigation. They activate automatically in contexts associated with the person. When the person dies, the models remain. The brain continues to generate predictions based on a social reality that no longer exists. And when those predictions fail, when the person is not where the model expects them to be, when the familiar sound or smell activates the model and finds nothing, the system generates what we call grief. The brain is not mourning, it is confused. The model says the person should be here, the world says they are not. But here is what that confusion drove ancient humans to do, and what they left behind in the ground for us to find 100,000 years later. The oldest confirmed evidence of intentional burial comes from the Kafse cave in Israel, dating to approximately 100,000 years ago. A child was buried with deer antlers placed deliberately across the body, not scattered by accident, but positioned. Someone chose to put those antlers there. The choice implies intention. The intention implies that the body mattered beyond its biological function, that what was done with it carried meaning. This is the threshold moment that archaeologists have spent decades trying to locate. Not the first death. Death is as old as life. But the first time a group of humans treated a dead body as something that required a response beyond disposal. The Sungir burials in Russia, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago, are the most dramatic example of what that response could look like. 2 children buried head to head, covered in approximately 10,000 handcrafted ivory beads, representing years of accumulated labor invested specifically in their burial. Adult males buried nearby with spears, clothing, and extensive grave goods. The investment is staggering. In a group living at subsistence level, where every calorie and every hour of labor had survival value, the decision to invest years of effort in the burial of 2 children represents a prioritization that only makes sense if the dead were understood to matter in a way that extended beyond their physical existence. And here is the finding that pushed the origin of intentional burial back further than anyone expected. In 2015, researchers excavating the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa found the remains of at least 15 individuals of a species called Homo naledi, a hominin with a brain approximately 1/3 the size of modern humans, in a chamber accessible only through an extraordinarily difficult passage. The bodies appear to have been deliberately placed, not washed in by water, not dragged by predators, placed. If confirmed, this would mean that intentional treatment of the dead predates anatomically modern humans by hundreds of thousands of years. Something in the hominid lineage understood that the dead required a response long before we were fully human. But burial was only the beginning. What drove the group to do it, the psychological force behind every grave ever dug, is where the story gets genuinely strange. The most influential theory of why humans developed elaborate responses to death comes not from archaeology but from social psychology. Terror management theory, developed by Jeff Greenberg, Sheldon Solomon, and Tom Piszczynski in the 1980s, proposes a specific answer to what makes human responses to death unique. The argument begins with a paradox. Humans have a powerful survival drive, a biological imperative towards self-preservation that we share with every other animal. But humans also have the cognitive capacity to know that they will die, not just to respond to immediate threats, but to understand abstractly that their existence is finite and that death is inevitable. The awareness of inevitable death in an organism with a survival drive produces, according to TMT, an existential terror that requires management. The management strategies humans develop, cultural worldviews, belief in symbolic immortality, the elevation of the self through identification with enduring groups and values, are the psychological infrastructure built to contain this terror. Every element of culture in the TMT framework is partly a response to the awareness of mortality. And here is where TMT connects directly to what ancient humans did when someone died. The death of a tribe member is not only a personal loss, it is a reminder. The most immediate, concrete, undeniable reminder available that death is real and that it comes for everyone. The elaborate treatment of the dead, the burial, the grave goods, the ceremony, the ritual, is not only about the dead person. It is about the living. It is the group's collective response to the terror that the death has activated, transformed into a cultural practice that asserts meaning in the face of meaninglessness. Multiple studies confirm that reminders of mortality increase investment in cultural worldviews, increase generosity within the group, and increase the importance of symbolic markers of belonging. In a prehistoric group that has just lost a member, all of these effects would be operating simultaneously. The burial is not just sending someone off. It is the group reasserting its own existence, its own continuity, its own meaning, in direct response to the reminder that neither is guaranteed. If this is changing how you think about something, subscribe. Every week there is a new origin story of something you do every day. Now, what happened after the burial is the part nobody talks about. Beyond the burial itself, what happened to a prehistoric group in the weeks and months after a member died involves dimensions the archaeological record cannot capture, but that ethnographic research on traditional cultures illuminates in detail. The first practical reality was the redistribution of the dead person's roles. In a band of 30 to 50 people, every adult carries specific responsibilities, specific hunting knowledge, specific plant identification expertise, specific social roles within the group's dynamics. When that person dies, their roles do not disappear, they are redistributed. Ethnographic research on traditional hunter-gatherer groups documents formal and informal processes for this redistribution. Younger members assume responsibilities they were not yet carrying. Established members expand their domains. Knowledge that was held by one person is reconstructed from memory, from whatever remains of what others had observed or assisted with. This process is not without loss. Some knowledge dies with the person who held it. The specific expertise of a skilled tracker developed over decades of practice cannot be fully transferred. The group that loses an experienced elder loses something that cannot be replaced by redistribution alone. The second reality was the management of grief within the group. Anthropologist Paul Rosenblatt, whose cross-cultural research on grief covers 78 cultures, found that every culture studied has specific social practices for managing grief, defined periods of mourning, behavioral restrictions for the bereaved, social support structures that concentrate around the person experiencing loss. These practices serve the practical function of managing a member of the group who is temporarily less functional, whose cognitive capacity is impaired by grief, whose motivation is disrupted, whose social participation is reduced. The group's response to grief is, in part, a collective management of a temporary disability. And in a group small enough that everyone knew everyone, the grief was not private. It was shared. The loss of one member was a loss felt by every member. The person who died was woven into the fabric of every other person's daily life. And that fabric, with them gone, needed to be rewoven. The burial was the beginning of that process, not the end of it. The Homo naledi deliberate burial interpretation is contested. Some researchers argue the bodies may have entered the chamber through other means, geological processes, predator activity, that do not require intentional placement. The debate is ongoing, and the evidence is not yet conclusive. The terror management theory framework, while influential and extensively tested, has been critiqued for overreaching in its claims. Not all cultural behavior is plausibly traced to mortality salience, and the theory's scope has been questioned. The cross-cultural grief research documents universal elements but also significant cultural variation in how grief is expressed, how long mourning lasts, and what behaviors are considered appropriate. The universals should not obscure the real variation. What is well established? Intentional burial appears in the archaeological record at least 100,000 years ago. The investment represented by burials like Sungir implies that the dead were treated as persons whose departure required significant social response. Grief is a universal human experience with consistent neurological underpinnings, and every documented culture has specific practices for managing death within the group. So what did ancient humans do when someone in the tribe died? They grieved, not as a cultural performance but as a neurological reality, the prediction models failing, the familiar contexts activating the wrong expectations, the social world reorganizing itself around an absence that felt wrong in a way that mere absence should not feel. They buried not because they had a theology that required it, but because the body of someone they knew required something, required acknowledgement, required the assertion that this person had been here and had mattered. They redistributed, they remembered, they rewove the fabric. And in doing so, they did something that no other species does with the same elaboration, the same intention, the same cultural weight. They told the death that it was not the end of the story, not the person's story that was finished, but the group's story, the meaning they shared, the continuity they were committed to. The grave is not where the person goes. The grave is where the living go to say that losing someone does not mean losing everything. That message is 100,000 years old. It has not changed. One question. Is there someone whose absence still feels like a presence, whose specific absence you notice in specific contexts, in ways that still catch you off guard? You do not have to name them, just drop the word yes in the comments if you know exactly what I mean. If this changed how you think about grief, hit like, and subscribe if you want to keep following these origin stories. See you soon.